In the dead of night beneath Windsor Castle, King Edward III made a choice that would save his kingdom and damn his soul. As the Black Death closed in, England turned to an ancient ritual buried in forbidden scripture. A girl was chosen. A blade was raised. And when her blood touched the altar, something answered. Ships filled with plague turned away, but so did every last trace of her existence. Why was she erased from history, and what ancient force demanded her sacrifice? Like. If her silence unsettles you, comment your theories and subscribe to learn the horrifying price of protecting the crown. The mist clung to the ancient stones like the breath of the dead, swirling around the base of the tower where King Edward III stood watching the horizon burn with the first light of dawn. His hands, weathered by war and stained with the blood of countless battles, gripped the cold iron of the window frame as if holding on to his very soul. Below in the courtyard, the preparation had already begun. The wooden platform stood like an altar to forgotten gods, its surface dark with the stains of ceremonies that history would dare not record. The scent of burning sage mixed with something far more sinister, something that made even the most hardened knights cross themselves and whisper prayers they had learned as children. The year was 1348, and the Black Death had already claimed a third of his kingdom. The villages lay empty, their streets littered with the bones of the innocent, while crops rotted in fields that no living soul dared to tend. The king's advisers spoke in hushed tones of divine punishment, of sins so great that God himself had turned his face away from England. But Edward knew the truth was far darker, far more ancient than any Christian doctrine could explain. In the deepest vaults beneath Windsor Castle, scrolls written in languages that predated Christ told of rituals that could turn the tide of fate itself, but at a price that would stain his soul for eternity. The chosen one stood in the shadows of the great hall. Her name was Isabelle de Montfort, barely 16 winters old, with eyes the color of autumn leaves and hair that caught the firelight like spun gold. She was not nobility, though her blood ran pure and untainted, which was precisely what the ancient texts demanded. The court astrologer, a man whose knowledge of forbidden arts had served 3 generations of kings, had spent months searching for the perfect vessel. Someone whose life force burned bright enough to appease the dark powers that held dominion over plague and pestilence, someone whose sacrifice would resonate through the very fabric of reality itself. Isabelle had been told she would serve her king in the highest honor, that her name would be remembered forever in the annals of English glory. What she did not know, what no one dared tell her, was that her memory would be erased from every chronicle, her existence wiped clean from the records of men. For what was about to transpire in the pre-dawn darkness could never be acknowledged, never be spoken of in the light of day. The ritual that would save England would also damn the soul of every man who witnessed it, binding them in a conspiracy of silence that would follow them to their graves. The preparation chamber beneath the castle had been carved from living rock centuries before the Normans ever set foot on English soil. Its walls were covered in symbols that hurt the eyes to look upon, geometric patterns that seemed to shift and writhe in the flickering torchlight. The air itself felt thick with the weight of accumulated centuries, heavy with the echoes of screams that had long since faded but never truly died. Here, in this place that existed between the world of the living and the realm of the dead, the ancient compact would be renewed. The price of a kingdom's survival would be paid in blood and terror, in the coin that the old gods demanded for their protection. As the cathedral bells of London chimed the hour before dawn, Isabelle was led through corridors that no map had ever charted, down stairs that descended far deeper than any foundation should reach. Her escort consisted of 12 hooded figures, men whose faces had been painted with ash, and whose voices had been stilled by vows of eternal silence. Each carried a candle made from the fat of executed criminals, their flames burning with an unnatural blue light that cast no warmth but seemed to draw the very life from the air around them. The girl's footsteps echoed like the heartbeat of the earth itself, each step taking her further from the world she had known and deeper into a nightmare that would echo through the ages. The ritual chamber opened before them, like the maw of some primordial beast, its ceiling lost in shadows that seemed to move with their own malevolent purpose. In the center stood an altar of black stone, its surface worn smooth by countless ceremonies, stained with the essence of lives given willingly and unwillingly to powers that Christianity had tried but failed to banish. Around the perimeter, 13 braziers burned with fires that gave off no smoke, but filled the air with the scent of copper and decay. The very stones beneath their feet seemed to pulse with an ancient rhythm, as if the earth itself was awakening to witness what was about to unfold. King Edward entered the chamber, wearing robes of deepest crimson, their fabric heavy with gold thread that formed patterns older than memory. Upon his head rested not the crown of England, but a circlet of blackened iron inscribed with runes that predated the Roman conquest. In his hands, he carried a blade forged in the fires of the first smiths, its edge keen enough to part soul from flesh with a single stroke. The weight of kingship had never felt heavier than in this moment, when the price of his people's survival demanded that he become something far worse than any tyrant history had ever recorded. The astrologer began the incantation in a language that had been old when the pyramids were young, his voice rising and falling in cadences that seemed to make the very air vibrate with forbidden power. The words themselves were like living things, crawling through the darkness and settling into the bones of every man present. As he spoke, the shadows in the chamber began to deepen, taking on shapes that suggested forms too terrible for the human mind to fully comprehend. The boundary between the world of the living and the realm of the dead grew thin, gossamer fragile, ready to tear at the slightest provocation. Isabelle stood at the center of it all, her white gown a stark contrast to the darkness that surrounded her, her face serene with the trust of youth, and the certainty that she served a purpose greater than herself. She had no knowledge of the true nature of her fate, believing until the very end that she was participating in some sacred ceremony that would bless the realm and protect her people. The innocent faith in her eyes would haunt the king's dreams for the remainder of his days, a constant reminder of the price he had paid for the crown's survival and the depth of the moral abyss into which he had willingly descended. The moment of sacrifice arrived, with the first ray of sunlight piercing the darkness above, a shaft of golden light that seemed to struggle against the oppressive atmosphere of the ritual chamber. The king raised the ancient blade high above his head, its surface reflecting not the light of dawn, but something far darker, something that seemed to drink in the illumination and transform it into shadow. In that instant, the weight of every decision that had led to this moment pressed down upon him like the crushing depths of the ocean. The survival of his kingdom, the lives of millions of his subjects, the continuation of the English crown itself, all balanced on the edge of this single terrible act. The blade fell with the inevitability of fate itself, and in that moment, the very fabric of reality seemed to shudder. The scream that arose was not entirely human, carrying within it harmonics that spoke of powers awakening from slumbers that had lasted since the dawn of time. The blood that flowed was not merely crimson, but seemed to contain within it the essence of life itself, flowing in patterns across the altar's surface that formed symbols of binding and protection. As the girl's life ebbed away, something vast and ancient stirred in the depths beneath the earth, acknowledging the sacrifice and accepting the compact that would shield England from the plague that ravaged the continent. The transformation was immediate and terrible to behold. The air in the chamber grew thick with a presence that was neither entirely malevolent nor benevolent, but something far older and more alien than human concepts of good and evil. The shadows that had gathered during the ritual began to disperse, but not before each man present felt them brush against his soul, marking him forever as a participant in this cosmic transaction. The plague that had been advancing inexorably toward England's shores suddenly halted its progress, as if running into an invisible barrier that no mortal eye could perceive, but that every dark power recognized and respected. In the days that followed, reports would arrive of the pestilence turning away from English ports, of ships heavy with disease and death finding themselves unable to make landfall on English soil. The Black Death that had devastated France and swept through the Germanic kingdoms seemed to bend around England like water around a stone, seeking easier paths and more vulnerable targets. The court physicians and theologians would debate endlessly about this miraculous preservation, attributing it to divine favor and the righteousness of English faith. But the 12 men who had witnessed the ritual knew the truth, and that knowledge burned in their minds like a brand that could never be removed. King Edward returned to his chambers as the sun climbed higher in the sky, the ancient blade cleaned and sealed away in a vault that would never again see the light of day. On his hands, no trace of blood remained, but he could still feel its warmth, still hear the echo of that final scream reverberating through his soul. He had saved his kingdom, preserved his crown, and protected millions of innocent lives from a death too horrible to contemplate. Yet in doing so, he had crossed a threshold from which there could be no return, transforming himself from a king into something far more complex and morally ambiguous. The girl's body was interred in a chamber so deep beneath the castle that it would not be discovered until archaeologists of the 20th century stumbled upon it while investigating medieval foundations. Even then, the true nature of her death would remain a mystery, her bones telling a story that scholars would puzzle over, but never fully understand. The official records of the court made no mention of Isabelle de Montfort, her name erased from every chronicle and ledger, as if she had never existed at all. The conspiracy of silence held firm, binding the survivors of that terrible dawn in a shared burden of knowledge that none dared speak aloud. As the years passed and the plague continued to ravage the continent while mysteriously avoiding English shores, the king found himself changed in ways that went far beyond the simple weight of guilty knowledge. He began to see patterns in the world that others missed, to understand connections between events that seemed random to mortal perception. The sacrifice had not merely purchased protection for his realm, it had opened his eyes to the deeper currents that flowed beneath the surface of human history, the ancient bargains and cosmic balances that determined the rise and fall of civilizations. The other witnesses scattered to the four winds, some seeking solace in monastery cells, where they spent their remaining years in prayer and penance, others throwing themselves into battle with a reckless abandon that spoke of men seeking death as a release from unbearable memory. The astrologer disappeared entirely, some said into the northern wilderness, where he sought to forget the forbidden knowledge that had marked his soul. Others whispered that he had been claimed by the same dark powers that had accepted the sacrifice, taken as payment for his role in the cosmic transaction. The crown itself seemed to grow heavier with each passing year, as if the weight of the girl's life had somehow been absorbed into the very metal and gems that adorned it. When Edward placed it upon his head for state ceremonies, he could feel the presence of that ancient compact, the invisible chains that bound him to powers older than Christianity and far more demanding than any earthly alliance. The protection of his realm had come at a price that extended far beyond a single human life, creating obligations and debts that would follow the crown through generations of kings yet to come. In the secret archives buried deep beneath Windsor Castle, a single document remained as testimony to that terrible dawn. Written in the king's own hand, but in a cipher that would take centuries to decode, it recorded the true cost of England's salvation and the dark compact that had preserved the realm from pestilence and ruin. The ink used to write these words was mixed with the girl's blood, ensuring that her sacrifice would never be entirely forgotten, even if her name was erased from the memory of men. The document bore a seal that hurt the eyes to look upon directly, its design incorporating symbols that seemed to move and shift when viewed in candlelight. The psychological toll of the ritual manifested in ways that the king's physicians could not understand and dared not investigate too closely. Edward began to experience visions that came not in sleep, but in the clear light of day. Glimpses of other realms where the laws of nature followed different patterns and where the consequences of human actions rippled outward through dimensions that mortal minds were not equipped to comprehend. These visions showed him the true scope of what he had set in motion, the ways in which a single act of desperate sacrifice had altered the fundamental balance between order and chaos that governed the world. The protection that surrounded England was not merely a passive barrier against disease and disaster, but an active force that subtly influenced events throughout the kingdom. Battles that should have been lost were won through inexplicable strokes of fortune. Storms that threatened the realm suddenly changed course, and enemies of the crown found themselves beset by misfortunes that seemed to arise from nowhere. The Dark Compact had made England itself into a charmed realm, but that charm came with a hunger that demanded periodic renewal, periodic sacrifice, to maintain the delicate balance that kept the ancient powers satisfied. As his reign progressed, King Edward found himself walking a tightrope between the demands of mortal kingship and the obligations he had assumed to forces that existed beyond the boundaries of human understanding. Each decision he made had to be weighed not only against its political and military consequences, but against its potential impact on the cosmic balance that protected his realm. The burden of this knowledge transformed him from a warrior king into something far more complex, a ruler who understood that true power came not from the sword or the crown, but from the willingness to pay prices that lesser men could not even imagine. The girl's spirit, rather than finding rest in death, became bound to the castle itself, a guardian presence that watched over the realm she had died to protect. Servants would sometimes glimpse her in the corridors late at night, her form translucent but still beautiful, still bearing the innocent trust that had marked her final moments. She appeared most often to those who bore the weight of difficult decisions, offering a silent reminder of the ultimate price that leadership sometimes demanded, and the courage required to pay it willingly. The ritual chamber beneath Windsor Castle remained sealed for decades after that terrible dawn, its entrance hidden behind false walls and forgotten passages. But the power that had been awakened there continued to pulse through the very foundations of the fortress, a dark heartbeat that synchronized with the rhythms of the kingdom itself. Those sensitive to such things could feel it in the deepest hours of the night, a thrumming presence that spoke of bargains made and prices paid, of protection purchased with the currency of human suffering. The king's confessor, Father Aldrich, was the only man outside the original 12 who learned the full truth of what had transpired in those depths. The weight of this knowledge nearly drove the elderly priest mad, his hair turning white overnight and his hands developing a tremor that would never leave him. He spent his remaining years crafting elaborate theological justifications for what had been done, trying to reconcile the brutal necessity of the sacrifice with the teachings of Christ. His private journals, discovered centuries later, revealed a man tortured by the contradiction between his faith and his knowledge of the darker truths that governed the world. The ripple effects of the ritual extended far beyond the simple preservation of England from plague. The cosmic forces that had been awakened by the sacrifice began to subtly influence events throughout Europe, shifting the balance of power in ways that would not become apparent for generations. Wars that might have devastated England were redirected toward other targets. Alliances formed and dissolved according to patterns that served the protected realm's interests, and the very weather seemed to bend itself to ensure England's prosperity, while other nations suffered drought and famine. Edward's queen, Philippa of Hainault, sensed the change in her husband immediately, though she never learned the true cause of his transformation. The man who returned to their chambers that dawn was fundamentally different from the one who had left, carrying within him a darkness that no amount of royal splendor could disguise. She would sometimes wake in the night to find him standing at the window, staring out at the grounds where the ritual had taken place, his lips moving in what might have been prayer or incantation. When she asked about these vigils, he would only say that he was watching over their people, ensuring their protection through means she could not understand. The 12 witnesses to the sacrifice found their lives irrevocably altered by what they had seen. Sir Geoffrey de Montmorency, the king's most trusted knight, became obsessed with documenting every strange occurrence within the realm, maintaining detailed records of unexplained phenomena that he believed were connected to the Dark Compact. His accounts spoke of shadows that moved without casting objects, of animals that spoke in human tongues, and of dreams that seemed to come from outside the dreamer's own mind. These chronicles were eventually sealed away in the same vaults that contained the ritual chamber's artifacts, deemed too dangerous for ordinary minds to contemplate. The astrologer who had conducted the ceremony, known only as Master Cornelius, had served the crown for 30 years before that fateful dawn. His knowledge of forbidden arts had been passed down through a secret lineage that traced its origins back to the court magicians of ancient Egypt. The ritual he performed to save England was but one of many such ceremonies recorded in his grimoires, each designed to manipulate the fundamental forces that governed fate and fortune. But the scope of what he had accomplished that night exceeded even his own understanding of the powers he had invoked. In the months following the sacrifice, strange portents began to appear throughout the kingdom. Flowers bloomed out of season, their petals bearing patterns that resembled the symbols carved into the ritual chamber's walls. Children born during this period often displayed unusual gifts, their minds naturally attuned to currents of power that remained invisible to their elders. These blessed offspring would grow up to become England's most capable leaders, artists, and scholars, though none would ever know the true source of their extraordinary abilities. The economic prosperity that followed England's mysterious protection from the plague created a golden age that would last for generations. While the rest of Europe struggled to rebuild from the devastation of the Black Death, English merchants found new markets opening before them, trade routes cleared of competition, and their ships blessed with favorable winds that carried them safely to distant shores. The wealth that flowed into the kingdom's coffers seemed inexhaustible, as if the very universe had been restructured to ensure England's continued prosperity. King Edward's later military campaigns were marked by victories that defied all military logic and strategy. The Battle of Crécy, where English longbowmen defeated a vastly superior French force, was attributed by chroniclers to superior tactics and divine favor. But the king knew the truth was far more complex, understanding that the protective forces he had unleashed were actively working to ensure his triumph on every battlefield. Enemy commanders would make inexplicable tactical errors. Storms would arise at precisely the right moments to aid English forces, and disease would strike opposing armies while leaving his own troops mysteriously unaffected. The secret of the ritual's location was guarded by a succession of loyal custodians, men chosen from among the most trusted servants of the crown and bound by oaths that extended beyond death itself. These guardians maintained the chamber in its original state, ensuring that the altar remained clean, the braziers supplied with their unholy fuel, and the symbols on the walls preserved against the ravages of time. They understood that their vigil was not merely ceremonial, but essential to maintaining the delicate balance that kept the ancient powers satisfied with their bargain. The influence of the sacrifice extended into the very fabric of English culture, inspiring works of art and literature that carried within them echoes of the forbidden knowledge that had been awakened. The great cathedrals built during Edward's reign incorporated architectural elements that subtly referenced the symbols carved into the ritual chamber, their spires and flying buttresses forming patterns that would channel and amplify the protective energies that surrounded the kingdom. Poets and troubadours found themselves composing verses that spoke of hidden truths and ancient powers, though they understood neither the source of their inspiration nor the true meaning of their words. The girl's sacrifice had been willing, though based on incomplete understanding of what would be required of her. In her final moments, as the king's blade descended toward her heart, Isabelle de Montfort experienced a revelation that filled her with terror and transcendent joy in equal measure. She saw the true scope of what her death would accomplish, the millions of lives that would be saved, the centuries of prosperity that would follow, and the cosmic significance of her role in the grand design of existence. Her acceptance of this fate in that final instant transformed the sacrifice from a mere ritual killing into something far more powerful, a voluntary offering that resonated through every dimension of reality. The aftermath of the ritual saw the emergence of new forms of knowledge within the kingdom, as scholars and natural philosophers found themselves capable of insights that had previously been beyond human reach. The universities of Oxford and Cambridge became centers of learning that attracted students from across Europe. Their curricula expanded to include subjects that existed nowhere else in the known world. These institutions would produce generations of brilliant minds whose discoveries and innovations would ensure England's continued dominance in fields ranging from navigation to medicine to military engineering. The protection afforded by the sacrifice was not absolute, requiring periodic renewal through lesser rituals and offerings. Every 7 years, on the anniversary of that terrible dawn, the ritual chamber would be opened and a smaller ceremony performed. These subsequent rites required no human sacrifice, but demanded other forms of payment. Precious artifacts cast into flames that burned without fuel, rare books of forbidden knowledge added to collections that would never be read by mortal eyes, and vows of silence renewed by each new generation of witnesses. King Edward's death, when it finally came 3 decades later, was as strange and portentous as his reign had been. He passed away not in his bed or on a battlefield, but in the very chamber where the great sacrifice had taken place, drawn there by forces that none could understand or resist. His final words, spoken to the empty air as if addressing an invisible presence, were, "The debt is paid, the compact sealed, the price accepted." Those who found his body noted that he appeared younger in death than he had in his final years of life, as if the ancient powers had claimed their due while simultaneously granting him a measure of the peace he had forfeited so long ago. The crown that passed to his successor carried with it not only the weight of temporal authority, but the burden of the dark compact that protected the realm. Each subsequent king would, in time, be made aware of the true source of England's prosperity and protection, forced to grapple with the moral complexity of a throne built upon sacrifice and sustained by forces that existed beyond conventional understanding. Some would embrace this legacy, others would rebel against it. But none would be able to escape the fundamental truth that their kingdom's survival depended upon bargains made in darkness with powers older than human civilization itself. She was promised honor. She was given to shadows. Isabelle de Montfort died so a kingdom might live, but history wrote her out, erased her name, and buried the truth beneath stone and oath. Yet England thrived. Storms shifted, enemies fell, and kings whispered to walls no one else could hear. Her blood bought centuries of power, but the debt never vanished. If this sacrifice shook you, like this video, subscribe. For more secrets thrones tried to bury, and comment whether you believe one life can balance a nation's fate.